Victorian era was a strange time full of rules and societal expectations, but some of these rules are definitely more bizarre than the others. From matters of the heart to matters of the stomach, let's waste no time and take a look at some strange rules that were at the center of decorum for people in the Victorian era. Starting off this list today, we have don't bow from a window. This is one rule that I truly can't quite wrap my head around. I mean, there apparently were just so many things you needed to think of during this time in history. During the Victorian era, a very peculiar set of societal norms dictated nearly every aspect of daily life, including some rather odd rules regarding social interactions. One such rule was about not bowing or acknowledging someone from your window to a person in the street, especially if they were of a lower class. This sounds exceptionally quirky today, but back then it was all about maintaining a clear distinction between different social hierarchies. The Victorians were keen on preserving decorum and ensuring that interactions did not blur the established lines of class distinction. This rule wasn't just about snobbery. It was woven into the fabric of society to uphold the era's rigid class structure. I just want to know what would happen if someone saw you bowing from your window to someone in the street. How do you really enforce this rule? Would you suddenly be shunned just because you were looking out the window one day? Honestly, I don't think I would have done very well in the Victorian era, by the sounds of it. Next up on our list, we have a gentleman calls, a lady visits. Of course, if the rules surrounding social interactions were so rigid, this is bound to include the relationships between men and women of the time. Guys were typically the ones to make the first move in terms of social plans, reaching out to women to arrange visits or outings. On the flip side, it was seen as quite forward, maybe even scandalous, for a woman to pop over to a man's place without having set up a time beforehand or without bringing along a chaperone. Could you imagine rolling up to a guy you're interested in's house, but you have to bring your dad along for the ride? Holy awkward. This protocol wasn't just about maintaining a sense of propriety, it was also a way to uphold a woman's reputation and adhere to the era's strict expectations around female virtue and decorum. The societal rules of the time were all about ensuring that every interaction occurred within a framework of respectability and under the watchful eye of a trusted companion, often to prevent any gossip or scandal that might tarnish a family's name. Next up, we have the fact that the double entendre was unacceptable. As we are learning, in the Victorian era, society was very buttoned up, especially when it came to matters of decorum and speech. We should do a little counter of how many times they say decorum. It's in the title, so I just kept using it. This notion of double entendre, or using words that could have a risque second meaning, was particularly frowned upon. This was especially true for, you guessed it, women, who were expected to embody the pinnacle of virtue and modesty. Any hint of sexual innuendo in conversation was deemed highly inappropriate and could tarnish a woman's reputation. The Victorian moral code was strict, and women were often held to an even higher standard than men. So, no funny puns or getting a little risque in your speech. That would absolutely suck. What if you accidentally did that without meaning to? I don't know, straight to jail, I guess. Next up, we have the fact that you were never supposed to wear Mosaic Gold. In the Victorian era, there was an unspoken rule against wearing Mosaic Gold, which essentially was just a type of cheap, fake jewelry made to look like the real deal. This guideline wasn't just about fashion, it tapped into deeper societal worries about class and the fear of coming off as trying too hard to seem affluent or sophisticated. It underscored a time when your outward appearance and what you wore could be a very telling indicator of your social status, and people were hyper aware of not crossing these invisible yet widely acknowledged boundaries. While today we definitely aren't as focused on this type of rule, it is interesting to see how there may be some remnants left lingering of this type of thought process in our society today. Next up, we have never discuss one's ailments. Of course, during these times, etiquette was taken very seriously, and there were some pretty peculiar rules that folks were expected to follow. One such rule was to never talk about one's ailments or any bodily functions when in polite company. The reason? Well, it was all about maintaining a certain level of decorum and not tarnishing the refined atmosphere of social gatherings. Victorians believed that discussing illness or anything to do with the body was in poor taste, as it could pollute the social space with undesirable truths. I guess in some ways this rule kind of still exists, but it likely isn't to the degree that it was during this era. The mindset was reflective of the era's broader obsession with cleanliness, propriety, and the public versus private spheres. While today we might find such a rule overly prudish or even kind of impractical, back then it was just part and parcel of their efforts to uphold a certain societal image and avoid any uncomfortable or taboo topics in conversation. Moving on down, we have the limit for courtship. Back in the Victorian era, the clock was ticking when it came to courtship. Society imposed an unspoken 3-season rule, discouraging lovebirds from dragging their feet. The idea was simple. If a couple couldn't decide to tie the knot within a year and a half, it was time to call it quits and scout for another partner. This norm pushed for prompt commitments, aiming to avoid the scandal and speculation that came with long-drawn engagements, reflecting the era's strict moral codes and emphasis on swift, yet considered decision-making in romantic endeavors. Sounds like the Victorian era would love Love is Blind or The Bachelor. While we look at these and think, man, these people are moving fast, the Victorians actually created the original 90 Day Fiancé. Next up, we have the handkerchief signals. During the Victorian era, it is very clear that society was buttoned up and monitored closely, but like they say, strictness creates sneaky people. These rules certainly didn't stop people from finding clever ways to communicate, especially when it came to romance. In fact, there are probably a lot of rules that made these secretive relationships all the more exciting. Among the quirky yet ingenious methods they devised was the use of handkerchief signals for flirting. This wasn't just random waving or dropping, it was actually a sophisticated code that enabled individuals to express interest discreetly under the watchful eyes of society. For instance, dropping a handkerchief could signal interest, while quickly fanning oneself might indicate that the flirter was already spoken for. This coded language allowed for subtle exchanges in a time when overt displays of affection were frowned upon, showing just how resourceful people can be when it comes to matters of the heart, even under strict social constraints. Next up on our list, we have the fact that men must offer their seats to ladies, unless it's on a train. Some say that chivalry is dead, but in the Victorian era, chivalry was situation dependent. One peculiar rule was the expectation that men should always offer their seats to women. This act of chivalry was seen as a mark of respect and good manners. This isn't very unusual. I feel like that is still a fairly common practice. However, there was a very odd exception when it came to train travel. Trains were often overcrowded, and there was a widespread concern that the seats, which might be dirty or soiled, could ruin women's elaborate and very expensive dresses. As a result, it was sometimes deemed more courteous for women to remain standing rather than risk soiling their attire. I feel like it would be so hard to keep up with all these rules. Next up, we have no seconds. This next rule is one that revolved around mealtime manners, particularly concerning the act of requesting seconds. In today's society, I feel like requesting a second helping is almost like a compliment, showing you enjoyed the meal so much that you want even more. In those times, however, showing restraint was key to being perceived as cultured and refined. Gluttony was seen as a lack of self-control and a lack of sophistication. Therefore, it was considered very impolite and uncouth to ask for a second helping during a meal. If a host noticed your plate was empty and offered more food, it was perfectly acceptable to accept. However, actively asking for more was frowned upon. Again, with these half rules, you have to give up your seat unless it's a train, no second helpings unless you've been asked. How did anyone keep up? And finally, today we have morning etiquette. I'm ending off today's list on a very dark note, so sorry about that. In the Victorian era, mourning wasn't just a personal process. It was bound by a complex set of societal rules that dictated everything from attire to social interactions, especially for widows. These norms weren't just for show, they were deeply ingrained in the culture, reflecting the period's intense focus on respect and the public display of grief. Widows, in particular, faced an extended period of mourning that could last for several years, during which they were expected to wear specific, often somber clothing and adhere to a restrictive lifestyle that could lead to social isolation. This extended mourning period wasn't merely about personal sorrow, but was also a way to maintain one's social standing and demonstrate respect for the deceased. While these practices were intended to honor the dead and support the grieving, they also probably only worked in ways that made the grieving process more difficult and even more isolating. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again very soon. Maybe tomorrow. Who knows? Bye!